It was a strange day, January 15th, 1919. Boston was a busy place then, like it always is. Ships came and went in the harbor. People worked hard in the factories and offices. Kids went to school. Life just carried on, normal life. But that day wasn't normal. Something happened that still sounds unbelievable when you hear about it. A giant wave of molasses, sticky and thick, came crashing down on a whole neighborhood. It killed people. It crushed buildings. It left a terrible, sweet smell that lasted for years. It was called the Boston Molasses Flood. And it really did happen. Boston back then was a city of change. World War I had just ended a couple months before soldiers were coming home. People were looking forward to a new year, a fresh start. Prohibition was about to start too. That meant no more making or selling alcohol. This detail actually is a pretty important part of the story. Because the company involved, Purity Distilling, they made industrial alcohol, and they used molasses to do it. The company had this massive storage tank. It was huge. Imagine a tank 50 feet tall. That's like a 5-story building, and it was about 90 feet across, like a big circle. And it held millions of gallons, like 2.3 million gallons of molasses. That's a lot of molasses. It sat right in the north end, a busy part of the city. There were houses around it. There was a fire station nearby. There was a raised train track, an elevated railway close by too. It wasn't in some isolated industrial area. It was right there, among people's homes and workplaces. The Purity Distilling Company had built this tank just a few years earlier, in 1915. They built it pretty quickly. They needed it. Molasses was cheap then, and they used it to make ethanol. Ethanol was used for munitions during the war. After the war, they planned to use it for other things, like rum, before Prohibition hit. So, they put up this big tank. And they put it up fast. But there were problems with this tank from the start. People who worked near it or lived by it, they noticed things. When the tank was first filled, it groaned. It creaked. It made strange noises. It leaked. Yeah, it leaked. Molasses would seep out from the seams. It would run down the sides of the tank. People in the neighborhood, the kids especially, they knew about it. They'd even collect the molasses in jars sometimes. It was a known thing. The tank wasn't perfect. It was a bit of a mess. Neighbors complained about it too. The leaks, the smell. But nothing really got done. The company, Purity Distilling, they seemed to brush it off. They said it was just a big tank. It would settle. They painted it brown, which helped hide the molasses stains a bit, but it didn't stop the leaks. The tank was a shortcut, I think. Built fast, maybe not built well enough for what it held. The man in charge of building it, Arthur Gell, he wasn't an engineer, he was a treasurer for the company. He just kind of oversaw it. He didn't follow all the proper steps. He didn't get all the right permits. There was no real inspection. No one checked the plans properly. No one made sure the steel was thick enough or that the rivets were strong. It was a big, dangerous container holding a huge amount of heavy, sticky stuff. And it was right there, in the middle of a city neighborhood. So, on that Wednesday in January, the tank was full. A fresh shipment of molasses had come in the day before. It was winter, but it was unusually warm that day, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The molasses inside the tank, it would have been cold and thick when it was put in. But with the warmer temperature outside, it would have been expanding a bit, maybe fermenting a little, which builds up pressure. This pressure, combined with a poorly built tank, was a disaster waiting to happen. The tank was just ticking, a giant unseen bomb made of molasses, and everyone around it, they were just living their lives completely unaware of what was about to hit them. It was just a normal day, until it wasn't. And then, it happened. It was about 12:30 in the afternoon. A Wednesday, people were at lunch, workers were coming back to their jobs, kids were probably out playing if it was warm enough. Then, there was a sound. People described as a roar, a deep rumble, like thunder, or a machine gun going off. Some said it sounded like a train coming. It was loud, really loud. And then the tank, that huge tank, just burst apart. It ripped at its seams. Metal plates flew off. Rivets shot out like bullets. Millions of gallons of molasses, 2.3 million gallons, suddenly had nowhere to go but out. It exploded outwards, a giant wave, a tsunami of molasses. It was 25 feet high, they said, when it first broke. It moved incredibly fast, about 35 miles an hour. Think about that. A wave of liquid that tall moving like a car. It was thick, dark, and unstoppable. It swept through the neighborhood with immense force. The molasses was heavy. It weighs about 11.7 pounds per gallon, so a huge volume of this stuff moving that fast, it was like a liquid battering ram. It didn't just flow, it crashed. It demolished everything in its path. Buildings were just ripped off their foundations. Wooden structures shattered. A fire station, right across the street, was practically flattened. It was a 3-story building, and the wave just crumpled it. People, caught in the open, had no chance. They were picked up and carried along. Some were crushed by the wave itself, others were knocked down and drowned in the sticky mess. Horses pulling carts were caught too. They stood no chance against that kind of force. Wagons were overturned, cars were tossed around like toys. The elevated train structure, that metal framework, it was actually pushed off its supports. A train car sitting on the tracks was knocked down. It was unbelievable destruction. The force of it was truly immense. Imagine being hit by a wall of liquid that's not water. It's thick, like syrup, but moving with the power of a flood. It didn't just flow around things. It broke through them. It picked up debris, making it even more dangerous. Pieces of buildings, parts of carts, everything became part of the deadly wave. The sheer weight of the molasses was what did the damage. It was like concrete, but it moved. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It was sweet, overpowering, a cloying, thick scent of molasses. It filled the air, mingled with the screams of people, the groans of collapsing buildings. It must have been a sickening mix of terror and that incredibly strong, sweet smell. It was a smell that lingered for weeks, months, even years. People said they could still smell it on hot days decades later. The burst wasn't just a simple break, it was a catastrophic failure. Investigations later showed that the tank had been built with steel too thin for its size and contents. The rivets, the things that held the steel plates together, they were faulty. They weren't put in right. The tank was a ticking time bomb, and the warmer temperatures that day, maybe a slight fermentation in the molasses, just pushed it over the edge. The internal pressure became too much for the weak structure. It was pure chaos in those first few minutes. The roar, the crash, and then this thick, dark liquid everywhere, it covered everything. Streets disappeared under it. Basements filled up. Houses were partially submerged. And people were struggling. Some were trying to help, others were just trying to survive. It was an instant disaster, a sudden, violent event that transformed a busy city street into a sticky, deadly trap. No one expected it. No one could have prepared for a molasses flood. The immediate aftermath was pure pandemonium. The wave had passed, but the danger wasn't over. People were stuck. They were tangled in the molasses. It was like quicksand, but even worse because it was so sticky. It was hard to move. It was hard to breathe if you were submerged. People were literally drowning in molasses. Some were trapped under debris, still alive, but stuck in the thick, heavy goo. The first people to respond were the neighbors. They heard the blast, they saw the destruction, they ran out to help, but it was hard. The molasses was everywhere. It was deep in places, several feet deep. Walking through it was a struggle. It pulled at your feet. It made every step exhausting. People tried to pull others out. They used ropes, they climbed over the wreckage. The fire station, Firehouse 31, was basically destroyed. Many of the firefighters inside were caught. Some were killed instantly, others were badly injured. So the very people who usually respond to emergencies were victims themselves. It took a while for other fire stations to arrive. When they did, they faced a scene unlike anything they had ever seen. Fire equipment, like ladders and hoses, became sticky and hard to use. Police officers arrived too. They tried to organize things, but it was chaotic. The molasses made everything slippery and difficult. It was hard to get a footing. It was hard to see clearly. The air was thick with the smell and the sound of people crying out for help. People from the nearby streets, office workers, anyone who could, came to assist. They formed human chains to pull people out. Rescuers faced a grim task. They had to search through the wreckage. They had to pull out bodies. They had to find survivors. The molasses made identification difficult. It coated everything and everyone. People were covered from head to toe in the dark, sticky substance. It was hard to tell who was alive and who wasn't. The horses were a particularly sad part of the rescue. Many were trapped and couldn't move. They struggled and panicked. Some had to be shot because they were too badly stuck or injured. It was a grim sight. The animals were as much victims as the people. Medical teams and ambulances also came. But getting through the molasses-covered streets was a nightmare. Horses drawing the ambulances struggled. People had to carry the injured out by hand, trudging through the sticky mess. The hospitals in Boston were quickly filled with molasses victims. They had broken bones, internal injuries, and respiratory problems from inhaling the molasses. The death toll started to rise. In total, 21 people died because of the flood. Men, women, children. People like Bridget Clufferty, a 65-year-old housewife, or Patrick Breen, a 44-year-old teamster, or John Barry, a 21-year-old laborer. They were just living their lives and then they were gone. About 150 people were injured, many of them seriously. The scene was devastating. The street was gone. It was just a sticky brown landscape of wreckage. Parts of buildings, twisted metal, broken wood, all covered in molasses. It looked like a giant monster had just stomped through the neighborhood. The initial panic slowly gave way to a grim determination to find everyone and start cleaning up. But no one really knew how to clean up millions of gallons of molasses. It wasn't like water. It was thick, it was heavy, and it was everywhere. The immediate rescue was just the beginning of a very, very long and difficult process. The cleanup was a huge undertaking, and it was pretty much unprecedented. No one had ever had to clean up a molasses flood before. You can't just hose it down like water. It's thick, sticky, and heavy. It clung to everything. There were buildings, streets, people's clothes, even the telephone wires overhead. The first step was just to get rid of the deepest pools. Firefighters, using fire hoses, tried to blast it away. But all that did, for a lot of it, was just move it around. And it mixed with water, making a kind of diluted, still sticky mess. They started using salt water from the harbor. That helped a bit. The salt helped break down the stickiness, but it was still a slow, painstaking process. For weeks, the North End was a work zone. Hundreds of workers were hired to shovel the molasses. They used brooms and scrapers. They hauled it away in trucks, wagon by wagon. People wore special boots to try and get through it, but even those quickly became coated and heavy. The air was still thick with the smell, which got worse on warmer days. Every single building that had been hit, or even touched by the molasses, needed a thorough cleaning. The molasses had seeped into everything. Cellars were filled, furniture was ruined. It had gotten into floorboards, brickwork, even the soil itself. It was almost impossible to get rid of entirely. People had to throw away almost everything they owned, if it had been hit by the flood. Imagine your house, your clothes, your possessions, all covered in sticky, sweet goo. The economic impact was huge. Businesses were destroyed. Their stock was ruined. Many people couldn't go back to work because their workplaces were gone or too damaged. The cost of the cleanup alone was enormous. The city had to pay for a lot of it. The Purity Distilling Company certainly didn't offer to help with the immediate costs. And the smell. Oh my god, the smell. People talked about it for years. Even decades later, on hot summer days, residents of the North End said they could still catch a whiff of that sickly sweet molasses smell. It had soaked into the ground, into the wooden structures, into the very fabric of the neighborhood. It became a kind of haunting reminder of what had happened. It was a smell of tragedy. The psychological toll on the survivors and witnesses was also severe. Many people experienced what we would now call PTSD. They had seen unimaginable things. Friends, family, neighbors dying in a sticky brown wave. They had struggled for their own lives. The memory stayed with them. The sound of a rumbling train, the sight of a large dark liquid, or even just the smell of molasses could trigger flashbacks. The community tried to recover. People helped each other. They rebuilt. But the memory of the molasses flood was deeply etched into the neighborhood. It became part of its history, a dark, bizarre chapter. The empty lot where the tank once stood remained empty for a long time, a visible scar. It took months for the cleanup to be considered done, but really, the effects lingered much longer. The soil was contaminated, everything needed to be scrubbed and re-scrubbed. The harbor itself was affected as molasses had flowed into it, turning parts of it brown and killing marine life. The entire area was just a sticky mess for a very long time. It was a slow, painful process of trying to get back to normal, but normal would never quite be the same after something like that. The flood changed the landscape, and it changed the people. After such a bizarre and devastating event, there had to be questions. Lots of them. Who was responsible? Why did it happen? And could it have been prevented? These questions led to a long and complicated legal battle. It was a massive lawsuit, one of the biggest of its kind in Massachusetts history. The case was brought against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which was the parent company of Purity Distilling. So, over 100 lawsuits were filed, people who lost loved ones, people who were injured, businesses that were destroyed, property owners whose homes were ruined. They all wanted justice and compensation. The total claims amounted to over $1 million, which was a huge sum of money back then. The trial lasted for years. It started in 1919 and didn't really conclude until 1925. That's 6 years of legal wrangling. Think about how long that must have felt for the victims, waiting for answers and resolution. There were over 3,000 witnesses called to testify. Experts in engineering, metallurgy, chemistry, and other fields were brought in. It was a very complex case. The company, of course, tried to deny responsibility. Their lawyers came up with all sorts of arguments. They suggested that the tank had been bombed by anarchists. This was a time of political unrest, with fears of anarchists and socialists, so it was a theory they tried to push. They also tried to blame it on an earthquake, but these theories just didn't hold up. The plaintiffs, the victims, argued that the tank was poorly constructed and poorly maintained. They presented evidence of the leaks, the groaning noises the tank made, and the general shoddy workmanship. Engineers testified that the steel was too thin. They talked about the weak rivets. They showed that the tank wasn't built to proper specifications. They pointed out that Arthur Gell, the man who oversaw its construction, wasn't an engineer and basically skipped critical safety checks. The court appointed an auditor, a man named Colonel Frank W. Hallowell, to investigate the claims and hear all the evidence. His job was to sort through everything and make a recommendation to the court. He spent years on this. He visited the site, reviewed the plans, interviewed witnesses. He was meticulous. Finally, in 1925, the auditor's report came out, and it was clear. He found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company responsible. He concluded that the tank was insufficiently strong for the purposes for which it was used. He basically said it was a failure of engineering and management. The company was negligent. Following the auditor's report, the company eventually settled with the victims. They paid out around $600,000. It's hard to put an exact figure on what that would be today, but it was a significant amount. It was money for medical bills, for lost property, and for the lives lost. It was a form of justice, even if it took a long time and couldn't bring back the dead. The Boston Molasses Flood led to some really important changes. It became a case study in industrial safety. Before this, there weren't many building codes for large storage tanks, especially not for these industrial ones. There wasn't much oversight. The disaster highlighted a huge gap in regulations. Because of the flood, new building codes were introduced in Boston and in many other places. These codes required engineers to properly design and inspect large structures. They made sure that calculations for stress and strain were correct. They required stronger materials and better construction methods. Permits became more rigorous. Inspections became standard. It meant that companies couldn't just throw up a massive dangerous structure without proper checks and balances anymore. The memory of the flood also served as a constant reminder. For generations in Boston, it was a story told. It warned people about the dangers of cutting corners, of prioritizing speed and cost over safety. The disaster, strange as it was, played a role in making industrial infrastructure safer for everyone. Today, there's a small plaque near the site where the tank stood, commemorating the victims. And while the smell of molasses has long faded, the story of the Boston Molasses Flood still stands as a stark lesson. It's a reminder that even the most unlikely things can cause immense tragedy if safety is ignored. It really shows how important it is to build things right, to check them, and to always, always think about the people who live and work nearby. It was a truly unbelievable event, but its impact on safety and responsibility was very real and long-lasting.